So thanks for being with us, guys. Be sure to subscribe and hit the like button. The podcast today, we've got Julia Soplop, who's recently written a book called The Information Crisis. And it really touches on a lot of things that we talk about on this channel, like moral arrogance. Where can we find truth? I think it's easier for the millennial generation, maybe Gen Z, to understand that the television news is not the place to turn to for truth. They almost can't afford to tell us the truth. So I want to see from a scientific writer, based on her new work, how does that relate? How can we find truth? What are some of the solutions that she has for us? So I want to thank you for joining us, and thank you for your time. I think our audience is really going to like this. So if I've got your background correct, Julia, you've got an undergraduate degree in French from Duke University, a graduate degree in science journalism, which I didn't even know there was such a thing, from Chapel Hill. So, and you've written 4 books, one of which is, maybe we could have a future conversation about it. Kind of reminded me a little bit of Guns, Germs, and Steel from Jared Diamond. Because I would say right after Guns, Germs, and Steel, Horses on the next thing. And I think it was called Equus Rising, about how the horse shaped U.S. history. So, but for today, we're really talking about the information crisis. So I want to thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Well, what's cool about it is like I got turned on to this cognitive science about 15 years ago, reading Steven Pinker's book, How the Mind Works. And what it did was it was so eye-opening and so scientific, especially for someone who's not a scientist. I started to recognize, hey, I needed to raise my game and to become an evidence-based decision maker as opposed to someone that goes from gut too often, because quite often that is misleading to us. So how did you get here? What caused you to write the book in the first place?
That's a good question. I had been sort of toying with the idea for a long time. As you mentioned, my background is in science writing, and so when I first went into the field about 20 years ago, I thought, if we can science is complicated and there are a lot of technical terms, and so I kind of thought the job of a science writer was just to sort of translate those technical terms, and if we can do that and turn them into lay language, then people will, of course, understand science. But over the years, I realized that we have a lot more barriers than simply just the language, in terms of how we go about, like you said, oftentimes we go on gut or on anecdote, and our the way that we determine whether we believe something to be true is maybe whether we want it to, or the emotions that it evokes, rather than turning to the evidence. And part of that is, I don't think we come out of school, regardless of how far we get in school or what our degrees are. I think oftentimes we don't come away, we've memorized lots of lists of facts and regurgitated them, but often we haven't come away with the skills necessary to actually make discerning choices about the information that we consume, and about thinking critically about that information when it's bombarding us. And so I actually, as I was finishing up Equus Rising, I did a quick little outline of this book, and thought, okay, this is going to be my next project. It's going to be sort of a user's guide to consuming health and science news. And it was going to be sort of like a tip, big tip sheet basically on how to choose sources that are accurate and balanced, and how to think about the credibility of a piece of scientific literature and things like that. And that was in December 2019. So 2019, right before the pandemic hit, I had outlined this little user's guide. And then the pandemic arrived, and I realized, oh my gosh, we are even in more trouble than I thought, when I started to see not only how people were confused about how to find accurate information, but then I was seeing that the sources of information, our public health officials, journalists, were really struggling to communicate science in an accurate and balanced way and realistic way. And I think that really hampered our response. So from both directions, from the public health angle, and then also from people, the public, having a really hard time deciphering, who can I trust, and how do I find this information? So anyway, the book kind of expanded from just this sort of practical guide into a larger, it has that component, but it's also a larger, an analysis of this information crisis that we're living in, where we just don't even know where to turn anymore to get information that can help us make really important decisions in our lives.
Yeah, well, I think if we were to reverse engineer it, the older generation, like a picture, it's 1989. Newly hired at Merrill Lynch, and I see how the financial press is distorting reality to make things scarier than they needed to
Mm,
be. Right? It was
yep.
almost like my daily conversations with clients was really about talking them in off of ledges that television journalists were sensationalizing data or really materially misrepresenting the data so
Hmm.
that to make things appear scarier.
Yep.
And I'm the summit of seven, and now I understand quite a bit about biology today rather than back then. I know that my mother was actually going through depression at the
Mm.
time, and I'm probably the cause of it. Having that many kids, I'm not so sure women come out the end of that process the same way that they went
Hmm.
into it. There's a real
Yeah.
strong argument in science that as soon as a woman has a child, her brain chemistry is completely changed forever.
Yeah.
She's like living for more than one human being, and that can have psychological effects on them. But one of the things I noticed was habitually she would sit down at night, watch the evening news while reading all three newspapers in New York City.
Oh, wow.
And all I did was I sat back, I looked at her, and I saw it as a feedback loop. I'm saying, okay, depressed, paper, television, depressed. And I just said, you know what? I don't want to be her. I don't
Hmm.
want to end up this way. So I made a willful decision to never read the front page of a newspaper ever again. Right. So I only read the Financial Times
Hmm.
or sports, and they're always buried deeper. So
Hmm.
and then I recognized my life was actually better as a result of that. I didn't perceive the world in a negative way that most people were. And it caused me to trip over a series of books. One of them was called The 100 Greatest Trends of the Last 100 Years, written by Julian Simon and I believe Stephen Moore. And it was eye opening, like how much progress we had experienced in 100 years. They were literally hired to prove how everything was getting worse in the 80s and 90s, and found they couldn't support that argument at all. In fact, only two things had actually worsened in the last 100 years. One of them was suicides, and the other was drug overdoses. So,
Hmm.
or it's actually in the category of poisonings. So it caused me to go on a mission to where can I find truth, given the fact that Walter Cronkite and Edward R. Murrow don't exist anymore. So, and I think for a legit reason. So this is what I tripped over in a conversation with Trevor Noah and Dan Rather, I believe. Trevor Noah talked about the fairness doctrine and
Hmm.
how that changed television news. In 1988, Ronald Reagan repealed the fairness doctrine, but Dan Rather gave a really strong argument he said, no, that started eroding in 1968 when 60 Minutes started to make money because no news program had ever made money prior to it.
Hmm.
They were forced to put these things on because they were fair and balanced. They couldn't make money off of it. So now
Hmm.
you start down this road where you start to move away from truth and more towards making the audience right in their misperception of the world.
Hmm.
So, and I think it's a real key thing. It comes from evolutionary theory about how it didn't benefit our ancestors to seek truth. It benefited our ancestors to make themselves correct. And what we now
Yes.
have is access to the greatest research tools that have ever existed in human history, should be the great emancipator of mankind, but what they really are is an idiotic echo chamber. So, and I've got my
Yes.
case studies, but I want to hear yours.
Yes, we really get in the way of ourselves to
Yes.
find accurate information because, like you said, our brains, we evolved in small groups, and the most important thing was group loyalty because we needed the
Hmm.
protection of the group, we needed the physical protection of the group, and it was more important to be part of the group and maintain that protection than actually know what was really happening. What the important thing was just being in the in group and having people have your back. And our brains haven't. The world around us has changed, but the human brain really hasn't changed much since that time. And so we still operate under these. When we are intaking information, we operate under these. Our brain is just mostly using a series of shortcuts to intake information and process them. We call them biases. And logical fallacies. But it helps us to make. We also need to be able to make or needed anyway, but often still need to make snap judgments. We need to make quick decisions. Back then, it was, I see a mountain lion, so I better run from it. Things like that. Now
Yeah.
but we still have to make quick driving decisions. We have to make um, last minute decisions, and big life changing decisions that sometimes we have to make rather quickly. And so those still the we oftentimes are those biases sort of, we don't realize that that's how we're thinking, but we're categorizing that things into right, wrong, yes, no, in group, out group, and that really informs the way that we are even willing to intake information.
Yeah, the way I heard it from a biologist is that better we recoil from a curly stick in the jungle
Yes.
and be embarrassed it's not a poisonous snake than to be standing over it going, hey, is that the poisonous kind? Because you're dead,
Yes.
right? So
Exactly.
because we can die so many different ways and entropy exists, we need to make fast decisions and then be embarrassed when they're incorrect. Like I
Hmm.
did one case study for my second book about why we evolved to be so politically divided.
Hmm.
And it was, I Googled Obama born in Kenya,
Oh.
and I got 1.26 million results. So, and my audiences, they like to fact check me. So
Hmm.
one guy, I can't remember where it was. It might have been in the South or it might have been in Chicago because I travel an absolute ton, so it's kind of hard for me to
Hmm.
remember. What happened was he Googled it, Obama born in Kenya, the exact same words, but he got 5.56 million results.
Oh.
And then what I do is I do a thought experiment with the audience. I just say, okay, let's pretend that person's normal. Like I recognize I'm not normal. Like I'm a very odd person. People who are fans of this channel or see me present know I am odd. And like I knew it from word go. I've spent 57 years on planet Earth, desperately trying to figure out why people do the things they do,
Mm.
and that's very unusual, especially for a man. It's used typically, women showcase those type of tendencies. They're more interested in working with people. Men are more interested in working with things. So I'm really odd. So let's assume that it's not me who's doing that research. Probably the person who would do that research of Obama born in Kenya leans right. Now, what does that person do with 1.26 million results? Do they read 1.26 million articles or whatever the hell you call those results? Do they even read 1.26 million headlines? Or do they see that as evidence that Google is telling them that Obama was born in Kenya and therefore doesn't qualify to be president, and then rush out on social media and lecture everybody else how stupid they are, proving their own foolishness?
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's really it's a cognitive trap that
Hmm.
is near impossible without the training of being a scientist.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to point out that we can use, a scientific attitude to approach any information, and we don't have to have. We don't want to kid ourselves and feel like, oh yeah, I am an expert in this or this because I, read one book. But there are a lot of tools that we don't need to be highly specialized, and this is something that I get into in the book, to recognize red flags and to be able to, so we don't need to be able to dissect whether a study was done at, whether this was a super super high quality study and it was designed perfectly to answer the question. um, you can't really do that without training and experience in a very specific field, but there are a lot of things that we can look for, red flags, that will tell us, hey, I better beware, I better look, I better find, a better source. If I want to know about this subject, this isn't the source for me, or this isn't a piece of evidence that's useful to me. And I think anybody with like a fairly small amount of training can become much more astute when they are looking for information. And
Well, this is something my audiences are asking me for. So it's
mm-hmm,
like, so what would be some of
yeah.
those examples of the red flags that you would see where the credibility starts to become questionable?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll start with saying what would be a good, what I would think of as a good source of information, and then we can work out from there. But something that, sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, that publication's biased, or that's can't trust them or something. And
simply because it just disagrees with them.
yeah, and so we ourselves are not like, let's not use ourselves and our own personal feelings about that's not what determines whether a publication is biased. We can actually have an independent group analyze that with and then we can listen to them. So what I think is biased is not really relevant. It's let's get a group of experts here from the entire spectrum and have them analyze it and tell, and let us know what they think about it. So I recommend, there are different groups that do this type of work looking at journalistic publications. And one that I recommend, that I use personally, is called Ad Fontes, and it's an organization that they do this. They have independent analysts, and for every article that they analyze, they have somebody who identifies as leaning right, somebody who identifies as leaning left, and somebody who identifies as more center. And they all read the same article. They do an assessment from different publications, and they rate a series of articles, and they're kind of constantly doing it so that those ratings may change over time. But what they're looking for are two important things. And you can't really just look at one of them and determine whether a source is credible and useful to you. You have to look at both of them together. And that's why I like this method. Is they're looking at fact reliability. So they're looking at, if you pick out statements of fact and you give it to a bunch of fact checkers, and they're going to go, and they are trained to look at the most credible source of information for that type of fact, and they all come back and say, yep, that's accurate, then you've got high fact reliability. And they're saying, yep, most of the time, no one's perfect. These are humans working at these publications, but most of the time, they do a good job getting their facts right. And then they also look at bias. So whether a publication is pretty neutral in terms of their political bias, or whether they lean a little bit right or very far right, or a little bit left or very far left. And what I recommend is, and this is a chart that they put together based on those two things. And I recommend staying towards, when you're looking for news sources, staying in the top couple of bars, which is the fact reliability for your information, and then staying towards the center. It's very hard for a publication to be absolutely dead on center. That's
Yeah.
almost impossible. But a little to the right, a little to the left, I would stay in that bracket if you are interested in actually trying to understand an issue and trying to make sense of it, rather than just, oh, I want to read something that's confirming what I want to be true. I think if you're getting out of that top center band, you have to start thinking about, well, what are my intentions here? Am I really looking for information evidence to inform my views? Or am I just paying for somebody to tell me what I want to be true? And I think that's an important conversation. Really, the first step is to have that conversation with yourself and figure out, are you genuinely interested in understanding how the world around you is working? And if you are, then you want to go towards those publications that are, more towards the center. And it's also important to recognize that when they do these analysis, they're typically not looking at the opinion pages of a newspaper, for example. They're looking at the news. So in this example of newspapers, we can look at the Wall Street Journal, which is a little bit right when you're looking at their news coverage. But if you add in their opinion page, oftentimes that goes further right. Whereas the New York Times is slightly left in terms of their news coverage, but then goes much further left when you figure in the opinion page. So when you're looking at an opinion page, that might be vastly different than their actual news coverage. Those are different. Desks.
That totally makes sense. It's like one is there for their opinion, but I think if I was to reverse engineer it, I think the internet versus the television news might be the worst sources. And the reason why is because they have to sell advertising space. And what we pay attention to today is no longer relevant existential threats because our mind evolved in the Pleistocene. So we're attempting to use a Stone Age tool to navigate the modern world, and the press and advertisers have to take advantage of that to sell us more stuff. So that what I noticed is, for example, the app Windy represents storms very differently than the Weather Channel. The Weather Channel will show you the satellite image as opposed to the radar image, and the storm looks gigantic. Like it'll fill up the entire screen of what we're talking about to scare the hell out of you. And my
Mhm.
wife still watches that stuff. So when I'm in like New Orleans, there was like I was in Baton Rouge, and there was a storm bearing down on New Orleans, which is not far from Baton Rouge. So she was worried. Like,
Mhm.
she kind of buys into that whole storm of the century thing because she grew up on the West Coast, and they weren't really exposed to bad weather. They didn't have the Weather Channel people like beating a screen telling you the world's coming to an end. I grew up on the East Coast, and I lived through, I don't know, 17 hurricanes. So it's like I kind of know to just turn a channel, right? It's like you don't really have to worry about this stuff unless you're on the water or what have you, or in the path of the hurricane itself. But what I noticed was when my wife said something to me, I happened to be in a Cajun restaurant in Baton Rouge when she called me about it. She's like, "There's a hurricane bearing down on New Orleans." I picked up my phone. I hit the app Windy. That's not trying to sell me anything, and the
Mhm.
storm was like literally the size of the head of my pinky, right?
Mhm.
It was like maybe a millimeter by a millimeter relative to the screen. But I looked up and they had the Weather Channel on, and that storm was looking like it was absolutely covering everything from New Orleans to Florida to Chicago. It looked like the end of the world. And all I sat back and said, well, okay, they're selling advertising space. This isn't. So
Mhm.
which one should I trust? Probably this one over that one for a proper representation. And there's a host of other categories here too. Are you familiar with Philip Tetlack?
I don't think so.
He wrote the book Super Forecasting. He actually
Okay.
won the inaugural IARPA award by the CIA. Like it was kind of, can you out CIA the CIA? Sometimes what the federal government does is they'll present an award like DARPA in order to encourage innovation in their chosen field.
Okay.
So he won the inaugural one. He's very, very humble guy. He's a professor of psychology at Wharton in the University of Pennsylvania. And he was having a conversation with Jonathan Haidt about the moral arrogance that's going on. He was really talking to
Yeah.
Jonathan Haidt about his latest book, which I think at that time was The Coddling of the American Mind.
Mhm.
So, but in the conversation, Philip Tetlock said to him, "Well, my research suggests," which is like, okay, you translate scientific terms. I translate that to this is a fact. Yeah, he
Mhm.
said my research suggests that we're either in investigation mode or prosecution mode. You cannot be in
Mm.
both simultaneously.
Yeah.
So what we need to do is spend a little bit more time in investigation mode, longer than we normally would, not so this way we're not seeking evidence to prove our argument correct. We're
Mhm.
actually pausing for a moment, taking a breath and saying, am I correct?
Right.
Because it's like it's better to be correct. But what you alluded to before was what I've heard from PhDs is called blue lies. It comes from in the 70s when New York City police officers that were ethical were confusing loyalty with ethics. So they would
Mhm.
protect the dishonest police officers because that was perceived as virtuous in that environment. So it's like white lies is you tell me I look good in this shirt when I don't because you're my buddy, right?
Mhm.
Like, it's a lie to tell to convince the listener that you're loyal to the listener. Blue lies are lies told to a coalition to prove loyalty, and the
Mm,
pernicious
mhm.
thing is the wackier the lie, the wackier the belief, more loyalty is produced in it. So,
Okay.
and that's really pernicious. So I think your type of work can help because what you're doing is you're articulating it differently than I do. So this way we can reach a wider audience. So
Mhm.
what I'm going to do is not only are we going to post this on our channel, I'm going to send this interview to all my audiences. So it's 30,000 deep at this
Oh
point.
my gosh.
Yeah.
Wow.
So what it is, because they keep asking me for where are sources of truth? Where can we
Yeah.
find this? And I think every one of us has been frustrated that way. I know when I graduated college in 1989, the prevailing economic theory of the day was something called the rational agents theory. This was proposed by Veblen in 1900. So it was 90-year theory. It was the basis of all economic thought that human beings are perfectly rational. The
Mm,
only thing
yeah.
stopping them from making excellent decisions was a lack of access to information.
Right.
Not only did the internet prove that to hell wrong,
Yeah.
so did Daniel Kahneman. But here's the
Yep.
dilemma of Kahneman. His research is brilliant, and his partner, no longer alive, was Amos Tversky. Their research on decision making is phenomenal. It turned
Mhm.
all economic theory on its ear, but Daniel Kahneman is like the worst author ever. So it's like reading his books are like, it's like self-flagellation. You're better off sitting in your basement and hitting yourself in the head with a hammer. So what I want to see is, how do we take his research, or
Right.
the body of evidence that the scientists can do, but wash it through a lens of someone who can actually write.
Hmm.
So it's not like a self-flagellation to read their books. So I've only met a handful of people that got through Daniel Kahneman's books, despite it being a bestseller. What I'd much rather read is his work through someone who can articulate it in a clearer way, not PhD speak that's ridiculously boring and you know self-abusive.
Yeah, I think that's the big challenge is actually, yeah, contextualizing scientific information so that it is, useful to someone who doesn't have a PhD and can actually be put into, yeah, it can be put into practical use. It is a big challenge. And I think going back to what you were talking about, how we figured out humans are not rational. And that's a big problem with a lot of economic models, is we don't often act in our own best interest. We get we get sidetracked. And I think one big underlying issue is, I think we oftentimes get the idea of critical thinking wrong, where and Jonathan Haidt talks about this in one of his books, in The Righteous Mind. But to think critically, we have to evaluate quality information sources first and determine, okay, what is the evidence telling me? Okay, that's what I'm going to believe is accurate. But usually we do it the other way around, where we feel something emotionally, we want something to be true, we've been told something is true, and then we go, like you said, Googling, Obama born in Kenya, and, well, what do you think is going to come up when you put that into the search terms? What did you
Yeah.
say? 5 million sites saying something to that effect, because that's what we're looking for. We're looking for that information to confirm what we want to be true. So I think just
Especially for,
recognizing that right off the bat can help us, and to think, okay, it's not, I mean, I've had people stand there and tell me, this is my method of critical thinking, and it's, somebody told me this was true, so I went and searched for that information that said it was true, and there was some, so now I understand it to be true. And I think that's not uncommon. And in some ways, that's how we are taught to make an argument. If you think about papers that we wrote in school, if you think about debate, we're given a topic and told, okay, tell everybody why this is true, right? So we're actually taught to think in that way. And that's oftentimes our job too. If we work for a company, if we work for an organization, okay, go out and tell people why to buy this product. It might not be the best product. They might not need it at all, but your job is to drum up reasons why they need to buy it, right?
yeah.
And so I think we get confused, because oftentimes that is what we are told to do, and that is what we are told is how we should go about thinking about things, when really we need to do the reverse, and we need to start from a neutral place and look to where the evidence is, right?
I think there's even something in there about, if your paycheck requires you to believe something, you're significantly more likely to believe it, right? So, like, I'll give
Right.
you an example. Like, based on my research, we pay attention to no longer relevant existential threats,
Hmm.
right? And we don't seek truth. We actually don't want it, because the truth is boring and complicated, right? So it's always more complicated than what our assumption is. I'll
Hmm.
give you an example. You're 5 times more likely to die from a vending machine accident than shark attack. Yet there isn't vending machine week on Discovery Channel for a reason.
And I'm
And
not afraid of them.
yeah, so part of this is like, okay, if you look at the History Channel, history is a form of science. It's a softer science, but it's a form of science, right? So if you also look at the Science Channel, the number one shows on both those channels are about ancient aliens.
Mm.
So, and let me just tell you a quick story. A buddy of mine who flies Black Hawk helicopters for the Air National Guard, right?
Hmm.
He was in every single military theater dating back to the original Iraq War. His co-pilot is the co-pilot from the mission of the Perfect Storm, right?
Mm.
So he was the guy that went out there and risked his life to save, unsuccessfully, and a few people got hurt in the process. But this guy's stories were phenomenal. And what he said was, we were watching the Perfect Storm, and he said, "Oh man, they have this boom on the front of the Black Hawk helicopter to do midair refueling." And he said when I think it was the port side, when if you lose the port side, you're never getting the starboard side. They
Mm-hmm.
might even just have the starboard side just to create symmetry on the plane so it doesn't lean one direction or the other, right? So I said, well, why is it so hard on the starboard side? Not knowing anything about flying helicopters, he said, well, because the prop wash from the tanker plane causes the starboard side to move even in the best of weather conditions. It's almost impossible to get it in good weather conditions, let alone the perfect storm. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So he said, wow, they got to ditch that. They got to ditch that helicopter. And I said, well, he goes, oh, that's incredibly dangerous, by the way. When you're midair refueling, even in the best of conditions, it's the equivalent to being shot at in combat.
Oh my
So
gosh.
what they do is they train for it at night in Arizona, and they bring in all the talent from around the United States. And then what they do in order to make it more of a pressure cooker, they jumble the talent each night.
Mm-hmm.
So you're sitting next to someone you don't know, and you're ordered to midair refuel 3 times. So you got to take down over a series of minutes that you could die any second, enough fuel, and then you're ordered to hover in place to waste the gasoline or the fuel.
Mm-hmm.
So that this way you're in a pressure cooker again because you're running out of fuel. You got to do it again. So they have to do it 3 times. So by the second time they've done this, they've caught up on where the other person's tour of duties were, jokes, family, all that stuff. So they're bored out of their minds. So what they do is they find pickup trucks on lonely stretches of highway, get them into a safe place on the highway, pull a trigger on the yoke. It floods the pickup with a light from underneath the helicopter. Then they disappear into the night sky and monitor the police frequency for UFO reports. Now tell me you wouldn't join the Air Force to do that. And I said, so I told that story to a cab driver in
Oh,
Scottsdale,
that's
Arizona.
amazing.
The guy literally pulled the cab over and sat there and sighed. And he went, man, that explains so much.
Oh my gosh. That is the UFO stuff is a great example of, I mean, we could use that to talk about some red flags in
Yeah,
terms
totally.
of,
Let's do it.
we've there's been some news lately about the stuff going on in the government, looking into,
Yeah, yeah,
they renamed UFOs. I forget what they're called now, but
yeah.
but anyway,
UAV.
looking into that, and then people are like, oh my gosh, because one guy said, oh, we have evidence of this or something like that, but I can't offer it to you, and it's all hit, all this kind of stuff. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm just watching this stuff going, okay, let's remember, I mean, some key things. When somebody tells you a fact about the physical world, so we're not talking about morals, values, things that are not, something that we can measure, but something that we can empirically measure. They need to provide substantiating evidence. Somebody
Yes.
saying something is not evidence, right? Somebody saying, oh, we have secret stuff hidden away, but I can't show you, is not evidence. We can ignore that. We can
Yeah.
ignore that and move on until they furnish evidence. Then we need to be open-minded. If somebody, comes and shows evidence of these things, then we need to exercise science. Science is all about open-mindedness, right? We have to be open-minded. So we would need to look at that evidence and determine whether it was quality enough to substantiate a claim, right? We wouldn't just say, no, I'm not going to look because I don't believe that aliens have come and done this. If good quality evidence comes, we're going to have to look at that too, right? But when somebody just says, oh, I said so, that's never, that is never quality enough evidence. To be
Yeah.
worried, first of all, to worry about something. We don't need to be worrying about it, and with that level of or lack of evidence. And we certainly don't need to be, when it comes to scientific evidence. I always say, sometimes people try to equate religion, like religion is a type of, or science is kind of a type of religion or something, but it's not at all. Those things are totally separate. They can also coexist.
Hmm.
They're just operating in different realms. But with science, there's no belief required. Whereas in religion, there's belief. That is what it is about. It is about
Yeah, it's a matter of
believing
faith.
something that we don't have
Yeah.
evidence or physical evidence for. Whereas science, there is no belief required. There are opinions, based on there are professional opinions based on a body of evidence on a certain topic, but there's no belief required. And so when you get into a position, I have a whole chapter on pseudoscience, red flags on pseudoscience versus actual science, which
Yeah.
is pseudoscience can be defined in different ways, but it's basically non-science dressed up as science. So it might have scientific type words, and it might even look like it's printed as if it's a scientific paper, perhaps. In a low quality or a predatory journal that's not an actual peer reviewed scientific journal. But pseudoscience is posing things that appear to be evidence, but have not gone under any type of scientific rigor, or are cherry picked, meaning some study that could be terrible, that we're going to ignore the entire body of evidence, and we're going to just cherry pick this one study that some random person somewhere did and put on the internet, and we're going to cite that instead and ignore the actual evidence. um, these are red flags when you're asked to believe something to be true about the physical world instead of actually just being presented with high quality evidence. um,
There's two things I'd like to jump in here on. One is I was lucky enough to sit next to my sitting congressman on a flight down to BWI.
hmm,
He was going on to DC to do a vote. I was going on to it was the first leg of a flight to Atlanta to do a series of presentations. When he found out what I did for a living, he started peppering me with a ton of questions. I'm like, well, I got a couple for you. And he said, now he politically he's very similar to myself. I'm really as much of a centrist as I think I can be. You know, given that salient point you made earlier, that we can never be 100% one. We either lean this way, and I would argue maybe we lean this way or that way on various different issues.
hmm,
You know, because what you don't want to
yep,
do is you want to be guilty of making up your mind before you hear the issue.
right.
Right. So, and in his case, so after he asked me the series of questions that he had for me, got a couple for you, and I said, I think the basis of us seeking information that's misleading or trying to prove ourselves correct is actually religious. I believe it
Mm,
comes down in so you did your deep dive in scientific journalism.
mhm,
I did mine in evolutionary theory because I'm trying
mhm.
to teach people how to predict the future more accurate. And at least we can predict human behavior because people are ridiculously boring. Like my famous line is the day you buy a minivan, even your car insurance company knows you don't look good naked anymore. Just kind of that's how life goes, right? So what we're going to spend our money on becomes highly predictable decades in advance. You can actually literally predict human behavior centuries in advance
Mm,
because people are just people, right?
mhm,
But we don't want to believe that about ourselves. We want to think we're unique and different. So what happens is, as a society gets less and less religious or more secular, that natural religiosity in us, the natural state of mankind is to be religious. If you need me to defend that argument, I will. But what that means is, as we get less religious as a society, that natural religion in us spills into the political sphere, and we create a new religion of national politics, where
mm,
we sacralize our political beliefs, and all compromise becomes sin. And I said to him, that's the reason why I see no difference between AOC and Marjorie Taylor Greene. I see them as two halves of the same stupid coin because they're prosecuting a false religious agenda politically and don't know it. Now, here's the cool part. He said to me, Mark, I sit next to Marjorie Taylor Greene. He said, if you talk to her about a construction company, she sounds like the most grounded, intelligent person you've ever met. When she talks about her political stuff, she actually believes it. And I think that's because the first delusion is self delusion. So I
mm,
think if you and I were having a debate about something that's really heady, really tough, and you're on one side of it, I'm on the other side of it. In the scientific method, if I understand it correctly, what we're really trying to do is I'm trying to use your confirmation bias to counter my confirmation bias. That's what peer review really is. So if I give you my life's work and you tear it apart and you can't, well, then you have a moral obligation to come back and say, yes, it's true. And then all it gets
mhm,
is what Michael Shermer, who is a professor of skepticism at Chapman University in California, what he argues is it's never truth with a capital T.
mm,
It's truth with a lowercase t, or what they call provisional truth.
mhm. Oh yeah, that would definitely be a scientific. I mean, we would never use the word truth in science, right?
Yeah, or
Because
certainty.
science is always, and or I mean, can we ever use that? I don't know, but we're always with science, we're always whittling away at our uncertainty.
Yeah,
Basically, I have a chapter called that, where we're not, we always have to be open to. You cannot perform science if you think that you have solved definitively anything, right? Because you have to
that's
have the open
scientific.
mindedness for if new evidence comes along, you have to evaluate it. It might not be it might not be quality evidence. It may not change our understanding, but it might, or it might indicate enough like, oh, well, there is this body of science that says this, but then there is this high quality evidence that just came in that contradicts it. So we need to look closer. We need to do more. We need to look into this more. So we always have to, and I think we have to use that in, whether it's science or just any aspect of our daily life when we're trying to find information, is we always have to have that like theoretical window of openness, even if something does feel certain to us, because that is one of our, like you said, we're predictable. There are studies that show that we have a certainty bias. We want to know things are okay. We want to be on the right side. We want to be on the right team. We want to know the answer. And we have to always, if we can just acknowledge that is actually, that helped us when we were living in these small groups, and we better follow the leader because he's telling us to run and hide in this cave. And that's what we're going to have to do to survive. But now we get ourselves into trouble when we feel certain about things, whether that's a group identity, and we identify with a group and their beliefs or their thoughts about how things work. We really get ourselves into trouble because it is so predictable that we will feel that way, that we are preyed on by all sorts of players across society.
Hmm.
They prey on that desire for certainty for power and profit. And it's over. I did a bunch of case studies in the book. I talked about disinformation around climate change,
Hmm.
anti-vaccine disinformation, other wellness industry, different like supplements and things like that in the wellness industry. And over and over, I just saw the same, and political manipulation and everything. Over and over, you see the same things preyed on. Like you said, we are predictable. We're not rational. So in that way, that can complicate things. We're not
Well,
rational in
maybe
that,
if I,
but we use these same shortcuts over and over. We want to categorize things. We want to be part of the group. We want things to be certain. We take our own experience or story, so we call it anecdotal evidence. We tend to weight that more highly than we weight actual evidence. We can have a huge data set that someone's trying
yeah.
to show us, but if we had a personal experience that doesn't align with that, we're more likely to go with a personal experience. And so we see, over and over that it's just very easy to manipulate somebody when you go after that and manipulate those ways that we process information.
What I like to tell my audience is when you're sitting down to watch Fox News with a scotch in your hand, that's not research.
Right.
Right. Like, same thing with MSNBC.
Yes.
So what I try to do is I try to get
Yeah.
them to stop
Yeah.
paying attention to the news. Like it's almost like any information that comes to you via the television is
Yeah.
fictionalized. Like, and I even go so far as to say, even sports. Like obviously you can see
Mhm.
behind me, I'm kind of an NFL lunatic. I'm a New York Jet fan, so the whole idea that I'm
Okay.
smart and you should listen to me just kind of went out the window. But the deal is that when a quarterback throws an interception, it bothers me. When they show it to me 7 more times in slow motion, it doesn't bother me less.
Right.
So it's how, because I think if we would dumb this down a little bit for an audience that does not have a science background, and I'm not
Mhm.
claiming to, but I've done a 15-year deep dive and written multiple books on the subject and studied multiple books on the subject. What happens is that the what we're attempting to do is prove ourselves correct. That is such a moral imperative for us to do because it mattered
Mm.
so much in our ancestral past. What this should be the great emancipator of mankind. Because at any one moment, it's the sum total of human knowledge. What is it really?
Right.
It's an idiotic echo chamber. Partially how I know this is because I'm the youngest of 7 and I was raised by
Mhm.
5 activists. So, and they were all in varying degrees of activism, but it turns out they were misguided. And like
Mm.
one of my sisters would turn, the smartest of all my sisters would turn and say, "It's like this." And then that verbiage would like bounce around the room a little bit. And one of my other sisters would go, "Yeah, you're right." And then they all
Mhm.
acted like they had scientific consensus. And I was a
Mhm.
little kid at the time, but I did something that I don't know if maybe this makes me odd too. When you're the youngest, you have the opportunity to learn from the mistakes of others. So I
Mhm.
kind of kept a mental notebook. I would sit back and go, okay, that's really stupid. Don't do that. All right, that's repeatable right there. So what I could do is cherry pick the evidence that I saw of what created success in their lives, and then cherry pick that. But being an activist is not one of those things. So
Mm.
what I find is I see a major threat to the American democracy. I
Mhm.
think because we are less religious. Now, I'm actually an atheist, but one of the books I'm working on right now is an atheist defense of religion.
Hmm.
So what's the good things that religion did? And one of them is humility. So like to me, mastery of the mind starts with moral humility. It strengthens with
Yeah.
accumulated knowledge, but it culminates with surrender. It's surrendering
Mm.
to the fact that we can never master our own minds.
Yeah.
That's why scientific method. So let me throw some credibility for those people who aren't familiar. It's only been with us for about 200 years, but it created the scientific revolution and all the reasons why we're alive today. Whether it's the comforts in our world, the fact that, the majority of us didn't die in childhood
Yeah.
like it would have happened 200 years ago. Whether it's literacy, all of those things can be drawn back to the fact that the scientific method has helped us actually create things that are objectively better than it was 200 years ago. And I would argue you can create objective truth on those things we can measure. The
Yeah.
catch is something that scientists call the gods of the gap, meaning
Mhm.
like at the frontier of science where we don't know. Scientists are kind of trained to be comfortable not knowing.
Mhm.
Like
Yep.
one of the things I do now is I judge people based on how quickly they're ready to say I don't know.
Mhm.
Right? That means they're actually smarter.
Yeah.
So although it proves the ignorance of the person, embracing our own ignorance. It was something phenomenal I saw Jonathan Haidt do on a podcast with Steven Pinker and Jordan Peterson, all of which are psychologists, in very different disciplines. But the Jonathan Haidt is like my hero because of this one thing I saw him do. Not only is the guy brilliant and doing really good work in the world, what he did was Jordan Peterson brought up something that Jean Piaget talked about, how children, or let's call them like young adults,
Mhm.
have a messianic call. They want to leave the world a better place, but they're often mired in doing it the wrong way, misguided activism. Right. So
Mhm.
they have this calling to leave the world a better place, but they lack the wisdom, maybe the intelligence, maybe the education to point their energies in the right direction.
Mhm.
He called it a messianic call. But the reaction of Jonathan Haidt was phenomenal, something we should strive for. He kind of sat up in his chair with a surprised look on his face and said, "I didn't know that." And he was psyched. Like, how many
Yeah.
people are psyched when they say, "I don't know that"? They're
You
usually
know,
embarrassed or ashamed. I
I
love
love,
that.
yeah, I love that, and I feel the same way, as you, that's sort of an immediate, like, "Oh, this is somebody I wanna get to know and I wanna listen to." Because in my book, I talk about the I don't knows, and I give an anecdote of, what my daughter, she's now 13, my oldest is 13, but when she was 3, we enrolled her. She has a severe peanut allergy, and we enrolled her in a clinical trial for to do a peanut desensitization. So it was a 3-year trial, and they basically just gave her increments, like a bit of dust of peanut, and
Yeah,
then
yeah, yeah.
worked up over years. And she started out the first day of the trial. She um, blew up, needed an EpiPen from like a little bit of dust of peanut. At the end of the trial, she ate 20 peanuts worth of dust without even a runny nose.
Yeah.
But I write about that trial and how the trial investigators, the way that in a chapter about determining credibility and expert, who is a credible expert, how can we find them? I talk about how this team, it was at UNC, they had sparkling credentials. I mean, they were, MDs, and PhDs, and they are immunologists. I mean, they pioneered this field. And so, yes, on paper they looked great. But what really sold me on when I felt like I could trust them and trust the relationship that we would have over these years was because when we sat down at the beginning of the trial, and we were thinking about enrolling her, and we were getting all the information, they spent hours on the phone with me and in person answering questions. And so many of the answers, because this is a very new field and was at the time, was the answers were, we don't know. We don't know yet. Your daughter's going to help us figure this out. And to me, I mean, it's very hard to hear that when you're asking questions about your kid's health and the impacts that something might have on them. It's so hard and scary
Yes.
to hear, I don't know. But that was the reality. And they were willing to say, the field is not there. We don't know. We're trying to answer that. And they were able to say, personally, I don't know. In my training, I don't know the answer to your questions. And that was the most revealing thing to me. Degrees aside, experience aside, was that was their attitude. And they were there to collect information and not make assumptions and figure things out. And had the humbleness to admit, we don't know. And that was something that had changed my life in terms of hearing that, because you don't often hear that from medical professionals, and oftentimes don't hear it enough from scientists. But it just, it was really informative for me personally, but also professionally. It made me think, okay, this is a type of source as a journalist that I feel like this is the type of person that I'm going to listen when they're talking to me, because I know they're going to tell me where things really are. And I think during the pandemic, we really saw public health officials fall down on that.
Yeah, without a doubt.
This was a new virus. We knew so little about it, and we needed time to figure things out, to gather evidence. And we came out of the gate saying, they came out of the gate talking in sort of certainty type language. We know
Yes.
this, and we did not. In a lot of ways, we had some evidence, and in science you go on best evidence, and you have to make choices in an emergency situation on best evidence, right? So, but you need to acknowledge that may change over time as you accumulate evidence. And I think that is where we really struggled with our science communication at just about every level. And it trickled down to journalists who were reporting on it, and just this idea of that you could have certainty,
Yeah.
on any of these issues when we knew so little. And that there was this idea that, oh, if we let people know that we don't have all this info, that we only know so much, they won't trust science. But I argue that went horribly wrong. And, I feel the same way just with raising my kids. I try very hard not to lie to them. That doesn't mean if they ask me something, I have to, give them information that might not be appropriate for them to know, but I would say that rather than lying about it. Right. And so
Yeah.
that's how you build trust in a personal relationship. And that's how you build trust, as a society as well, is saying, I don't know, when that's the most appropriate answer. And in science,
Yeah,
that is
it's humble.
often the answer. Yeah.
It's humility, because I think what we're
Yeah.
guilty of is we're so busy trying to be right,
Mm-hmm.
we're inaccurate. So I would rather be accurate than be right, because
Mm-hmm.
the moral overtones to the word right. Like, I'll give you an
Yeah.
example. It was
Yeah.
actually in your neck of the woods. It was in the Research Triangle. Now, this is going to be
Mm-hmm.
a little rough to hear, so I'm prepping you. Because I'm going to quote this woman accurately. I asked the question, what's the country that's had the greatest advancements in female empowerment in the last decade? And she screamed at me, it's not the United States. It was like a 10 on the tension scale, right? So I'm saying, and what do you do with that as a presenter? Like,
Right.
am I going to tangle with this woman? Like, or what I do now is I use her as a cautionary tale. I say to my audiences, do you think that woman was open to being wrong?
Mm.
Nobody, no matter how morally arrogant they are, is not open to being. She did not think that she was open to being wrong. I said, but is she wrong? And that's when I see people say to me, I don't know. And
Mm-hmm.
that's when I weigh in on that whole thing about that actually shows me you're intelligent.
Mm-hmm.
Because here's the ultimate dilemma. I believe it was Professor David Perkins out of Harvard did a massive study on IQ. And it turns out moral arrogance is not solved for by higher IQs nor advanced academic degrees.
Mm-hmm.
They just become better at articulating their stupid
Yes.
ideas. So,
Yes.
because
Yep.
it actually takes brilliant people to believe really stupid ideas. So, and with this, in the case of this woman, she wasn't wrong. So America has not had the greatest
Hmm.
advancements in female empowerment in the last decade, but she wasn't wrong for the right reasons.
Mm.
So you don't go from an A rating to an A plus rating and have that be as much advancements as going from an F to a C minus,
Mm.
like Iran, which is actually the answer. So there's a whole
Okay.
thing about, like, even if we talked about stepping back to your point about the pandemic,
Yeah.
it became so politicized that now wearing a mask is showing proof of what tribe you belong to. And the reason why I believe that that's so important is because we're the most collaborative, cooperative species on the planet. We there's a couple of funny lines about why we evolved language. One is so that we could lie about ourselves
Mm.
to improve our station within our in group, right? We could negotiate on our behalf. We believe we're more virtuous than we actually are, right? The reason why that's important is because if we were ostracized in our ancestral past, you died a horrible death.
Mm.
You were eaten,
Yeah.
but you became something else's lunch. But the reason why we're so collaborative, this comes from William von Hippel's book. I can't remember the title of it. He's an evolutionary biologist out of,
Mhm.
I believe, New Zealand. What his argument is, when we climb down from the trees in the savannah of Africa, our physiology changed so much that we went from basically our arms became arms, our
Mhm.
legs became legs. So we can now stand and we could deal death from far away. So
Mm.
we could throw rocks at lions, right? And what he
Mm.
argues is, once you collaborate, because one hominid throwing stones at a lion is lunch.
Great.
So 50 of us together, the lion's lunch. The second that happens, we become human, and then we dominate every ecosystem on planet Earth over the millions of years after that. But what then happens is we only have to worry about one other apex predator, other humans. So it was the tribe that could collaborate better, was even more religious, would outcompete the other tribe that was less
Mm.
religious or collaborated worse. So it was negotiating our station within our tribe is so
Mm.
important to us.
Yeah.
And the concept in evolutionary theory is whatever enabled our ancestors to survive long enough to procreate continues in the next generation. So that's the reason why your daughters are afraid of the dark. So
Mhm.
because in our ancestral past, bad things happen in the dark.
Right.
So if you had a child born in our ancestral past that wasn't afraid of the dark, it got eaten.
Right.
So it didn't live long enough to procreate. So when you start to kind of tear apart all of that, but there is one more thing I want to talk about: the credibility of science.
Yeah.
We need to trust science. So I had a debate with a sociologist a
Mhm.
couple of years ago. He's a relative, a
Mhm.
very, very smart guy, leans very far away from me politically. He's like a hard lefty. And
Mhm.
what he said to me, he got angry with me about one thing. And he said, "Well, do you trust scientists?" And I said, "No." And I like, this wasn't a gotcha moment. This wasn't like I planned to say this. I just said no. And he goes, then he got so upset. He stood up and he goes, "Well, do you trust science?" I said, "Yeah."
Yeah.
And it's the scientific method that you have to trust, not the scientist, if that makes sense, because they're a flawed human being too. And frankly, there's some stuff going on in the scientific community right now because of efforts to make things more compassionate are actually violating the scientific method. Like scientists are required to prove how their chemistry experiments are going to improve, like the plight of indigenous people. Why they're being required to do that, I have no idea. But then they don't get funded if they don't. So they're kind of being forced into a situation. The university systems I'm very troubled by it. And I
Yeah,
think
there's a
the
lot
deal,
going on there. There's a lot going on there. But this is a great point that I think there's often confusion about even when we talk about what scientific consensus means. I get into this in the book, is that when you hear it when it's thrown around, and oftentimes journalists will throw it around this way, it's as if it is the personal opinions of people who are scientists and that they all get together and they agree on something. And
no,
that's not what scientific consensus is. It is the agreement of literature, of the scientific literature, of the evidence. Science is always about the evidence. And yes, scientists are trained to try to reduce their biases in terms of, personal biases, but also just when you're designing an experiment, there are biases in there that they're trained to try to reduce those. But they are still humans. They make mistakes. They want tenure. So they have, there are ulterior motives because they are human. They need to make a living. And so they need to do work that will, win the grant or whatever. It will get them a secure position at the university. So they are humans, of course, who are people who are doing science. But really, you're right. It is the process that we need to trust, and that is different from the individual. And when I think about whether I trust a person, a human scientist, as a source, I think about one of my criteria is, depending on what the field is, there might be specific degree, there are probably specific degrees or certifications or experience or whatever, but a hugely important piece is that they have to be continually practicing science. So if you have all these degrees, but you're off talking about all this crazy stuff, the frontline doctors or whatever, you're not practicing science. You have left the room, right? So it
Yeah,
doesn't
yeah,
matter that you have all these degrees if you are not willing to you are not willing to follow this process and participate in the scientific community in the way that moves science systematically forward. You lose your credibility. So that is a hugely important point, that it's not about the person, it's about whether they are participating in the process.
yeah. Well, one of the things that Mike and I decided when we launched this podcast was to be the source of truth as best we possibly could, because Mike leans politically differently than I do.
Mm-hmm.
So although I'm a centrist, the I don't really lean left or right. He leans more left than I do,
Mm-hmm.
and he's a Democrat. So
Okay.
I'm actually a registered Republican, but I've voted for all the different types of presidents that you could possibly do so. And I'm a little tired of the two camps being in charge of everything at this point.
Yeah.
What I don't want to do is I don't want to be guilty of politicizing things before I actually understand them. I want
Mm-hmm.
to make up my mind after I hear the evidence, and that's not always easy to do. You
Yeah.
really, we're actually asking people to not be human in
Mm-hmm.
order to increase accuracy. But I think that's what the scientific method proved. That's what it does for us. So I think we have to embrace that and recognize where's the source of information that we're getting from. So I think your work
Mm-hmm.
is needed. So when does the book actually come out?
So it comes out April 16th.
Okay,
So just a
cool.
few weeks from when we're recording. Yeah.
Yeah, well, the thing is, I think by the time this is edited, it'll come out right around that time period. So we're going to make sure.
Great.
What we'll do is we'll embed a link into where they can source the information from, because this is what they're asking me for anyway. So here
Yeah.
you go. So
Wonderful.
I really do appreciate your time. Keep up the good work. All right,
Thank
Julia.
you. This was a fun conversation.
So thanks for being with us, guys. Be sure to subscribe and hit the like button. So thanks again for your time. See you next time.
Thanks.